October 1895, Covington, Tennessee. A traveling minister walks into the county sheriff's office and asks to speak in private. What he says that morning will not be written into any official record for 47 years. In 1942, a descendant discovers a leather journal hidden in the false bottom of an old steamer trunk. Inside, 7 pages of notes in the sheriff's own handwriting. At the top of the first page, underlined twice, the widow Pruit and her sons, a matter too delicate for public record. The pages describe a family living 11 miles outside town, in a hollow so remote that even postal riders refuse to go there after dark. 3 sons, 1 mother, and a carved inscription above the fireplace that read, "In the house of the faithful, the seed is sown and the harvest is kept." What Sheriff Benjamin Wade discovered in that hollow would haunt him until his death in 1903, and what happened to those sons has never been fully explained. This is the story of Constance Pruit, the 3 boys she raised and the vows she taught them to make. Before we begin, if cases like this fascinate you, subscribe and turn on notifications. Comment where you're watching from. It helps us keep investigating the stories history tried to bury. The family. The Pruit family lived at the end of a narrow dirt path that wound through oak and cedar so thick the sun barely touched the ground. Constance Pruit was 41 years old in the autumn of 1895. Her husband Jeremiah had died 6 years earlier in a logging accident near the Tennessee River. He left behind Constance and their 3 sons, Daniel 23, Samuel 20, Jacob 18. The family owned 40 acres that had been in the Pruit name since 1827. They grew tobacco, kept hogs, sold firewood in town twice a year. By all accounts, they were unremarkable, quiet, God-fearing. They attended church every 3rd Sunday and paid their taxes on time. But in the summer of 1894, something changed. A local merchant named Horace Tibbs noted in his ledger that the Pruit boys stopped coming into town. The widow began making the trips alone. She bought flour, salt, lamp oil. She never spoke unless spoken to. And when she did, Tibbs later told Sheriff Wade, her voice sounded like someone reading from a script they'd memorized long ago. By winter of 1894, rumors began to circulate. A woman named Eunice Cardwell, who lived on a farm 3 miles from the Pruit Hollow, told her husband she'd seen the widow walking through the woods at dawn, barefoot in the snow, carrying a bundle wrapped in cheesecloth. Eunice said the widow's lips were moving, but no sound came out, just her breath rising in the cold air like smoke. Another neighbor, Fletcher Gaines, stopped by the Pruit cabin one evening to return a borrowed axe. He knocked for 10 minutes. No one answered, but he could hear voices inside, low voices chanting. He said it sounded like a prayer meeting, except there was no melody, just words repeated over and over in unison, like men reciting an oath. Fletcher left the axe on the porch and never went back. Then in March 1895, something happened that would later be considered the first real warning sign. A traveling peddler named Morris Klein stopped at the Pruit cabin to sell seeds and fabric. He was invited inside by the widow herself. Klein later told Sheriff Wade the cabin smelled like tallow and old flowers. The widow served him cornbread and water. Her sons sat at the table with them, but they didn't eat, didn't speak. They just watched him. Klein said their eyes were the same shade of gray as their mother's, that their hands were calloused and identical, that when he looked at the 3 of them together, he couldn't tell which one was the eldest. Klein left within 20 minutes. As he was loading his wagon, he glanced back at the window. The widow was standing there, her hand pressed flat against the glass. Behind her, just barely visible in the lamplight, Klein said he saw something hanging from the ceiling. A garment, a dress maybe, but it was too small, like something made for a child. He didn't ask about it. He never went back to that hollow again. By the time Reverend Thomas Halcombe arrived in Covington that October, the Pruit family had become a subject of quiet speculation. People didn't talk about them openly. It was considered improper to gossip about a Christian widow and her boys. But the stories persisted. Stories about lights in the woods at night, about hymns sung in voices that didn't quite sound human, about the way the widow smiled when she came into town, like she knew something no one else did. The Reverend's visit. Reverend Halcombe heard these stories during his first evening in Covington, over supper at the home of Deacon William Cross. He listened carefully, asked questions, and on the second night of his revival, after the congregation had gone home, Halcombe told the deacon he intended to visit the Pruit family himself, to offer them spiritual counsel, to see if they needed anything. Cross tried to dissuade him, but Halcombe was insistent. He said it was his duty. Reverend Halcombe rode out to the Pruit Hollow on the afternoon of October 23, 1895. He brought a Bible, a loaf of bread, and a small jar of honey as a gift. The path was overgrown. Twice his horse refused to go forward, and Halcombe had to dismount and lead the animal by hand. He later wrote in a letter to his brother that the woods felt wrong, that the trees grew too close together, that the silence was not the silence of peace, but the silence of something holding its breath. When he reached the cabin, the widow was standing in the doorway. She was wearing a plain brown dress with the sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun. She smiled when she saw him. Halcombe said her smile was warm, but her eyes were not. She invited him inside without asking his name or his purpose. The cabin was dark despite the afternoon sun. The windows were covered with flour sacks dyed deep blue. The air smelled like lye soap and something else, something sweet and rotting, like fruit left too long in a cellar. The three sons were seated at the table. They stood when Halcombe entered. They were tall men, broad-shouldered, with the same angular faces and the same gray eyes. They did not offer their hands. They simply nodded and sat back down. Halcombe said a prayer of blessing over the home. The widow thanked him. Then she offered him cider and biscuits. They spoke for nearly an hour. Halcombe asked about their faith, their health, their crops. The widow answered every question with calm precision. Her son said nothing. They sat with their hands folded on the table, their heads slightly bowed, like children waiting for permission to speak. At one point, Halcombe asked if they attended church regularly. The widow said they did not. She said the journey was difficult and that they preferred to worship at home. She said the Lord heard their prayers just as clearly in the hollow as he did in any chapel. Halcombe did not argue, but he noticed something then. On the wall behind the widow, there was a piece of wood nailed above the fireplace. It had been carved with words. Halcombe squinted to read them in the dim light. The carving said, "In the house of the faithful, the seed is sown, and the harvest is kept." He asked the widow what it meant. She smiled again. She said it was a family verse, something her husband had carved before he died. Something to remind them that family was sacred, that blood was a covenant, that the Lord blessed those who kept their house pure. Halcombe left the cabin an hour before sundown. The widow walked him to the edge of the clearing. She thanked him for his visit. She told him he was welcome to return any time. But as Halcombe mounted his horse, she said something that stopped him cold. She said, "Reverend, do you believe that love can be a form of obedience?" Halcombe turned to look at her. He asked what she meant. The widow's expression didn't change. She said, "I mean that some vows are made in private between a woman and her God, and that those vows are more binding than any made in public." Halcombe didn't respond. He rode back to Covington in silence. That night, he couldn't sleep, and the next morning, he walked into Sheriff Wade's office and told him everything. The investigation begins. Sheriff Benjamin Wade was 54 years old in the autumn of 1895. He had served as county sheriff for 19 years. He was not a man easily disturbed, but something in Reverend Halcombe's tone made him listen. Wade later wrote in his journal that Halcombe looked like a man who'd seen something he couldn't unsee, something that had shaken his faith, not in God, but in the goodness of people who claimed to serve him. Wade asked Halcombe what exactly he thought was happening in that hollow. Halcombe said he didn't know, but he said the widow spoke about family in a way that felt wrong, that her sons obeyed her in a way that went beyond respect, that the house itself felt like a place where something unholy was being protected. Wade told Halcombe he would look into it, but he was cautious. The Pruits had broken no law. They owed no debts. They had harmed no one. Wade could not simply ride out there and demand answers based on a feeling, so he began to investigate quietly. He spoke to neighbors. He reviewed county records. He visited the church and asked the pastor if the Pruits had ever requested counsel or confession. No one had anything concrete to offer, just suspicions, just unease. Then in early November, Wade received a letter. It was unsigned. It had been slipped under the door of his office sometime during the night. The letter was written in careful script on a torn piece of brown paper. It said, "Sheriff Wade, if you want to know the truth about the Pruit widow, ask her where her daughters are buried." Wade read the letter 3 times. He had no record of the Pruits ever having daughters. According to census records, Jeremiah and Constance Pruit had only sons, 3 boys, no girls. But Wade could not ignore the letter. He wrote out to the county clerk's office and requested the birth records for the Pruit family going back 30 years. What he found disturbed him. In 1873, Constance Pruit gave birth to a daughter named Abigail. The child died 6 months later. Cause of death, fever. In 1876, she gave birth to another daughter named Ruth. The child died at age 2. Cause of death, unknown. In 1879, she gave birth to a third daughter named Naomi. That child lived to age 4. Cause of death, drowning. 3 daughters, all dead before the age of 5. Wade sat in the clerk's office for over an hour, staring at those records. He thought about the carved words above the widow's fireplace. In the house of the faithful, the seed is sown, and the harvest is kept. He thought about the way the sons sat in silence, the way they watched their mother, the way she smiled. Wade returned to his office and wrote a letter to the state medical examiner in Nashville, requesting any records related to infant or child deaths in Tipton County between 1870 and 1885. The response came 3 weeks later. There were no records. The examiner noted that most rural deaths during that period were never formally investigated. Families buried their own. Pastors kept their own books. The state only intervened when foul play was suspected. Wade realized then that if something had happened to those girls, no one would have questioned it. Death was common in the mountains. Children died from fever, from accidents, from weakness. It was tragic, but it was normal. No one thought to ask why one family lost 3 daughters and kept 3 sons. No one thought to ask what the widow prayed for when she knelt beside those small graves. The midwife's testimony. Wade decided he needed to go back to the Pruit Hollow, but this time, he would bring someone with him. Someone who could ask questions a lawman could not. Sheriff Wade contacted a woman named Margaret Ashford, a midwife who had lived in Tipton County for over 30 years. Margaret had delivered more than 200 children in the region, including all 3 of the Pruit sons. Wade trusted her. She was discreet, observant, and respected by the families she served. He asked her if she remembered anything unusual about the Pruit births. Margaret sat quietly for a long time before she answered. Then she said yes. She said she remembered that Constance Pruit had been different after the 3rd daughter died. that something in her had changed. Margaret said that when she delivered Daniel, the first son, in 1872, Constance had wept with relief. She kept saying the same words over and over while she held the baby. "This one will stay. This one is mine." Margaret said she thought it was just the grief talking, that Constance was afraid of losing another child. But when Samuel was born 2 years later, Constance didn't weep, didn't smile. She just looked at the baby and said, "He is promised." Margaret asked what she meant. Constance didn't answer. And when Jacob was born in 1877, Constance held him to her chest and whispered something Margaret couldn't quite hear, but it sounded like a prayer or an oath. Wade asked Margaret if she would accompany him to the Pruit cabin. He told her he needed a woman's perspective, that he needed someone who could speak to the widow in a way he could not. Margaret agreed, though she admitted she was frightened. On November 19, 1895, Wade and Margaret rode out to the hollow together. It was late afternoon. The sky was gray and low. When they arrived, the widow was standing in the yard, hanging laundry on a line stretched between two trees. She did not seem surprised to see them. She greeted Wade by name. She smiled at Margaret and said it had been many years since they'd spoken. Margaret said it had. The widow invited them inside. This time, the sons were not at the table. The cabin was empty, except for the widow herself. Wade asked where the boys were. The widow said they were working in the timber, that they would return by nightfall. Wade said he had some questions about her daughters. The widow's expression did not change. She poured them each a cup of water from a clay pitcher. Then she sat down at the table and folded her hands. She said, "I wondered when someone would ask." She told them that her daughters had been weak, that they had been born small and fragile, that despite her prayers, the Lord had taken them. She said she had grieved each one, that she had begged God to let them live. But after Naomi drowned in the creek behind the house, Constance said she realized something. She said she realized that daughters were not meant for her, that God had a different plan, that He wanted her to raise sons, strong sons, faithful sons, sons who would honor their father's name and keep the family whole. Wade asked her what she meant by keep the family whole. The widow looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "A house divided cannot stand, Sheriff. A family that scatters is a family that dies. My sons know this. They have made their vows. They will not leave me. They will not marry outside this house. They will keep the blood pure and the name alive." Margaret felt her stomach turn. She asked Constance what she meant by vows. The widow smiled. She said, "The same vows any wife makes, to honor, to obey, to remain faithful unto death. If you're still watching, you're braver than most. Drop a comment and tell us, what would you have done if you were Sheriff Wade?" The confrontation. Sheriff Wade stood from the table. He asked Constance directly if she was claiming to have married her own sons. The widow did not flinch. She said that marriage was a word the law used, that the church used, but that in the eyes of God, a covenant was a covenant, that she had raised her sons to understand that their duty was not to the world, but to their mother, to their blood, to the promise their father had made before he died. Wade asked, "What promise?" The widow rose slowly from her chair. She walked to the fireplace and ran her fingers along the carved words above the mantel. She said that Jeremiah had been a faithful man, that he had loved her with a love that understood sacrifice, that before he died, he had told her the family must not end, that the Pruit name must continue, that if she could not bear more children, then the sons must stay. They must provide. They must keep the house from falling into ruin. The widow turned back to face Wade and Margaret. She said, "I did not force them, Sheriff. I taught them. I raised them to see that love is obedience, that loyalty is devotion, that the world outside this hollow is filled with sin and distraction, but here, in this house, we are clean. Margaret Ashford would later tell Wade that the widow's voice never wavered, that she spoke with the calm certainty of someone reciting scripture, that there was no shame in her, no hesitation, only conviction. Wade asked where the sons were truly working. The widow said they were cutting timber near the eastern ridge. Wade said he wanted to speak with them. The widow said they would not tell him anything different, that they understood their place, that they had chosen this life willingly. Wade left the cabin without another word. Margaret followed him. They rode in silence until they were halfway back to town. Then Margaret began to weep. She said she had delivered those boys with her own hands, that she had held them when they were hours old, and now they were living as their mother's husbands. Wade asked her if she believed the widow was telling the truth, if the sons had truly chosen this. Margaret said she didn't know, but she said she remembered the way Constance had looked at baby Jacob, the way she had whispered over him. And Margaret said she believed that whatever vows those boys had made, they had been taught to make them long before they understood what they meant. The journal Wade returned to his office and spent the next 2 weeks trying to determine if any law had been broken. Tennessee had statutes against incest, but those laws required proof of a physical union. Wade had no such proof. The widow had admitted to a spiritual covenant, to a family arrangement, but she had not confessed to anything the courts would recognize as criminal. Wade consulted with a judge in Memphis. The judge said that unless Wade could produce evidence of abuse, coercion, or harm, there was nothing the law could do. The Pruit sons were grown men. They were not being held captive. They had not filed complaints. They had not asked for help. The judge said that sometimes the law could not reach into the private convictions of a family, that some darkness was too well hidden. Wade knew the judge was right, but he could not let it go. In early December, Wade rode back to the Pruit Hollow one final time. He went alone. He went unannounced. When he arrived, the cabin was dark. The yard was empty. The door was unlocked. Wade stepped inside and called out. No one answered. The house smelled like ash and old meat. The table was bare. The beds were made. And on the floor near the fireplace, Wade found a leather-bound journal. The journal belonged to Daniel Pruit, the eldest son. It contained entries dated from 1892 to October of 1895. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, like someone writing with great effort to be understood. Sheriff Wade took the journal back to his office and read it in full. What he found inside would never be entered into public record. Wade wrote in his own journal that the contents were too disturbing, too shameful to be shared with the community, but he summarized what he had read, and those summaries were discovered decades later, locked in that steamer trunk. Daniel Pruit had written about his mother with reverence, with fear, with something that resembled love, but was shaped by years of conditioning and isolation. He wrote that after his father died, his mother had gathered the 3 sons together and told them that they were all she had left, that the family was sacred, that God had taken the daughters because daughters leave, but sons, faithful sons, remain. Daniel wrote that his mother began teaching them scripture in a new way, that she told them the story of Ruth and Naomi, of loyalty that transcends law, of devotion that the world would not understand. She told them that the greatest sin was abandonment, that the greatest virtue was to stay. Daniel wrote that when he turned 20, his mother gave him a ring. It had belonged to his father. She placed it on his finger and told him that he was now the man of the house, that he would care for her as his father had, that he would honor her in all ways. Daniel wrote that he did not understand at first, but his mother was patient. She taught him that intimacy was obedience, that the body was simply another way to demonstrate faith, that what happened between them was blessed because it kept the family whole. Samuel and Jacob received their rings on their 20th birthdays as well. Daniel wrote that his brothers accepted their roles without question, that they had been prepared since childhood, that they believed, as he once believed, that their mother was a prophet, that she had been chosen by God to preserve something pure in a world full of corruption. But in the later entries, Daniel's tone began to change. He wrote that he had begun to feel sick, that he could not sleep, that he heard his sisters' voices in the woods at night. He wrote that he had found something buried beneath the floor of the old smokehouse, something wrapped in cloth. He did not say what it was, but he wrote that after he found it, he understood what his mother had done, what she had been doing all along. The final entry in the journal was dated October 27, 1895, 4 days after Reverend Halcombe's visit. Daniel wrote, "I am leaving tonight. I cannot stay in this house any longer. I do not know if Samuel and Jacob will come with me. I do not know if they can see what I see now. But I know that if I stay, I will become something worse than dead. I will become her. God forgive me. God forgive us all." The vanishing Sheriff Wade never found Daniel Pruit. He searched the hollow, the surrounding woods, the riverbanks. He sent inquiries to neighboring counties. No one had seen him. No body was ever recovered. When Wade returned to the cabin in late December, the widow was gone. Samuel and Jacob were gone. The house had been abandoned. The livestock had been slaughtered and left in the barn. The furniture was still inside, but the beds had been stripped. The carved words above the fireplace had been scratched out, gouged deep into the wood as if by fingernails. On the table, Wade found a single sheet of paper. It was a letter addressed to no one. It said, "We have gone where the law cannot follow, where judgment cannot reach. The faithful do not answer to men." The Pruit family was never seen again. Some say they fled west into the territories where names could be erased and histories rewritten. Some say they died in the woods that winter, consumed by cold or madness or both. Others believe they are still out there, in some forgotten hollow, living under new names, teaching new children the same old prayers. Sheriff Benjamin Wade kept Daniel's journal until his death in 1903. In his final entry, written just days before he died, Wade wrote, "I have spent 8 years trying to forget what I learned in that house, but I cannot, because I know now that there are some kinds of love that are not love at all. That devotion can be a cage, that faith can be twisted into something monstrous, and that the most dangerous people are not those who reject God, but those who believe He has given them permission to do the unspeakable." The journal was sealed and hidden. The case was never officially opened. The Pruit family became a whisper, a rumor, a story told in low voices by those who remembered. And in the hollow where they once lived, nothing grows. The land remains barren. The cabin has long since collapsed. But on quiet nights when the wind moves through the trees, people say you can still hear it. The sound of hymns sung in voices that do not quite sound human. The sound of a family that never left, that never could. In 1942, when that journal was finally discovered, the descendant who found it contacted the Tennessee State Archives. They asked if the case should be reopened, if there should be an official investigation. The state declined. They said too much time had passed, that everyone involved was likely dead, that reopening the matter would serve no purpose except to dredge up pain for families who might not even know their connection to the Pruits. The journal was archived, restricted access, filed under historical records, sensitive material. It remains there today. Daniel Pruit would be 151 years old if he had lived. Samuel would be 148. Jacob, 146. But somewhere in the back corners of Tennessee genealogy forums, people still ask questions. They ask if anyone has records of a Constance Pruit who moved west in the 1890s. They ask if anyone has found birth records for Pruit children born after 1895 in territories that later became states. They ask if anyone has seen that carved phrase, "In the house of the faithful the seed is sown and the harvest is kept," anywhere else. No one has answers, but every few years, someone claims to have found something. A gravestone with no date, a census record that doesn't quite match, a family story about ancestors who came from Tennessee and never spoke about where they'd been before. The trail always goes cold, but the questions remain. Because the most terrifying thing about the Pruit family is not what happened in that hollow. It's that we will never know if it ended there. If this story has stayed with you, leave a comment below. Tell us what you think happened to Daniel. Tell us if you believe some secrets should stay buried. And subscribe to Lost History Docs because there are more stories like this one. Stories that were never meant to be told, but someone has to tell them. Someone has to remember. Remember their names: Daniel Pruit, Samuel Pruit, Jacob Pruit, and the 3 daughters who died before they could speak for themselves: Abigail, Ruth, and Naomi. The past isn't dead. It's carved above a fireplace in a hollow where nothing grows.